In 2026, the United States housing market is operating under a set of conditions that demand a level of financial discipline that most first-time buyers are simply not prepared for. Mortgage rates, while modestly off their multi-decade peaks, remain elevated enough to compress affordability across virtually every major metropolitan corridor. Inventory has stabilized in some markets, but remains structurally constrained in the high-demand suburban and coastal zones where first-time buyers tend to concentrate. What this means in practical terms is that the margin for error has narrowed considerably. Buyers who overpay or who fail to account for the full cost architecture of homeownership are not simply making a financial miscalculation. They are entering a position that may take years to unwind. Resale risk is no longer a secondary concern. It is the primary lens through which any serious acquisition should be evaluated. The 10 factors we are about to examine are not edge cases or anomalies. They are structural costs embedded in nearly every residential transaction in the United States, and their cumulative weight is consistently underestimated by buyers who have only modeled the purchase price and the mortgage payment. The first and perhaps most immediately impactful cost is the property tax trajectory. First-time buyers frequently evaluate a property based on the seller's current tax bill, which in states with assessment caps, California's Proposition 13 being the most widely known example, can be dramatically lower than what the new owner will actually pay. When a property transfers, the assessed value resets to the purchase price. On a $900,000 home in a county with a 1.2% effective tax rate, the annual bill is $10,800. If the previous owner had been paying $3,400 based on a decade-old assessed value, the buyer who modeled that figure into their debt-to-income ratio is now carrying a payment that is materially different from what they anticipated. Over a 10-year holding period, that discrepancy compounds significantly, and when that buyer eventually attempts to sell, the higher carrying cost relative to comparable properties suppresses the pool of qualified buyers and extends time on market. The second hidden cost is homeowners insurance, which has undergone a structural repricing across large portions of the United States that shows no sign of reversing. In Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and increasingly in California and Colorado, private insurers have either exited markets entirely or raised premiums to levels that are functionally prohibitive. A $1.1 million home on Florida's Gulf Coast that carried an annual premium of $4,200 in 2019 may now require $18,000 or more annually, assuming coverage is available at all. When private markets withdraw, buyers are pushed into state-backed last resort programs like Citizens in Florida or the California Fair Plan, which offer narrower coverage at elevated cost. Mortgage lenders require hazard insurance as a condition of financing, which means that an insurance premium spike after closing, triggered by a major storm event or a carrier reassessment, can create immediate cash flow pressure with no contractual exit. Buyers who do not stress test insurance costs across multiple scenarios are introducing a significant variable into what they likely assumed was a fixed cost. Third is the private mortgage insurance obligation, which applies to any conventional loan where the down payment is below 20% of the purchase price. PMI is not a protection for the buyer, it insures the lender against default risk. On a $750,000 purchase with 10% down, annual PMI premiums typically range between $4,000 and $6,750, depending on the borrower's credit profile and the loan structure. It adds directly to the monthly payment, reduces the debt-to-income headroom available for other obligations, and delivers no equity benefit to the buyer. The common assumption that PMI automatically terminates once the loan-to-value ratio reaches 80% is partially correct, but in a flat or declining market, that threshold may take years longer to reach than a simple amortization schedule would suggest, particularly if the home fails to appreciate or experiences a modest value correction. Fourth is the HOA fee structure, which in new construction and condominium markets has become one of the most poorly understood recurring costs in residential real estate. Monthly HOA fees in high-amenity communities across the Sun Belt, the Mountain West, and coastal markets routinely run between $400 and $900 per month. What buyers rarely scrutinize with sufficient rigor are the reserve fund disclosures and the deferred maintenance schedules. A community with a visually appealing common area, but an underfunded reserve account, is a community that is building toward a special assessment, a one-time charge levied on all unit owners to fund capital repairs that the monthly dues were insufficient to cover. Special assessments for roof replacements, elevator modernizations, or seawall repairs in coastal communities have reached six figures per unit in documented cases. Lenders treat HOA fees as a fixed obligation in debt-to-income calculations, and a significant fee increase, which requires only a board vote, not buyer consent, can reduce the pool of mortgage-qualified buyers for that property at the moment of resale. Fifth is the closing cost structure, which on the buy side routinely reaches 2 to 4% of the purchase price in addition to the down payment. On a $950,000 transaction, buyers should anticipate between $19,000 and $38,000 in closing costs, covering origination fees, title insurance, attorney fees in attorney-state jurisdictions, prepaid escrow items, and transfer taxes where applicable. Many first-time buyers conflate this with the down payment or treat it as a negotiable variable, only to discover at closing that their liquidity position has been more severely impacted than their initial projections reflected. This has direct implications for the post-close financial position. A buyer who has exhausted liquid reserves at closing has no buffer for the immediate maintenance and repair costs that nearly every property requires within the first 12 to 24 months. Sixth is deferred maintenance, the physical cost of owning a structure that previous owners managed with a schedule oriented towards sale rather than toward long-term capital preservation. Inspection reports frequently identify issues that are technically within acceptable tolerances but that represent known future expenditures: aging HVAC systems, roofs within 5 years of their actuarial end of life, plumbing infrastructure that meets code but shows wear indicators consistent with near-term failure. A financial model that does not allocate 1 to 1.5% of home value annually for maintenance and capital replacement is not a realistic model. On an $850,000 property, that is between $8,500 and $12,750 per year that does not build equity, does not reduce principal, and does not generate any financial return. Buyers who underestimate this figure frequently defer necessary work, which accelerates deterioration, elevates cost at the time of eventual repair, and creates a disclosure obligation that can directly affect sale price. Seventh is the cost basis of utilities and operating expenses in markets where energy infrastructure is aging or where climate conditions impose a seasonal intensity that buyers relocating from temperate markets have not experienced. Natural gas prices, electricity grid reliability, and water costs vary enormously by geography. In Phoenix and Las Vegas, summer cooling loads can produce monthly utility bills of $600 to $900 in homes without modern insulation packages. In older northeastern homes, winter heating costs for oil or propane can reach $4,000 to $6,000 for a single season. These are not incidental expenses. They are structural carrying costs that affect the real monthly cost of ownership and that buyers rarely model with geographic precision when comparing properties across markets. Eighth is the capital gains tax exposure on eventual sale. For primary residences, the federal exclusion, $250,000 for individuals, $500,000 for married couples filing jointly, applies only to homes that have been the primary residence for at least 2 of the 5 years preceding the sale. Buyers who purchase in appreciating markets, hold for fewer than 2 years due to a job relocation or life event, or who own investment properties that do not qualify for the primary residence exclusion can face a federal capital gains tax liability that materially reduces net proceeds. In high appreciation markets where a $900,000 purchase has grown to $1.4 million over 6 years, the tax exposure on the gain above the exclusion threshold is not trivial, and in states with their own capital gains treatment, California, New York, and New Jersey among them, the combined tax burden can approach 30% of the gain above exclusion. A buyer who does not account for this in their exit modeling is overstating their expected net return. Ninth is mortgage interest deductibility limitations, which since the 2017 federal tax legislation have been capped at interest on $750,000 of mortgage debt for new loans. For buyers in the $1 million to $2 million purchase range who had anticipated significant itemized deduction benefits, the reality of the post-2017 framework frequently produces a smaller tax benefit than expected, particularly when the standard deduction is considered as the alternative.
In high-tax states where the SALT deduction cap of $10,000 is already consuming the majority of itemized benefit, the mortgage interest deduction provides diminishing marginal utility. Buyers who have modeled their effective monthly cost incorporating a tax benefit that their actual filing situation will not produce are overestimating their affordability in a way that compounds annually. 10th is transaction cost symmetry, the cost of selling. Buyers who focus exclusively on acquisition costs frequently fail to model what it will cost to exit the position when resale becomes necessary. Traditional sell-side commission structures, while under pressure following recent legal developments, continue to represent a meaningful transaction cost. Attorney fees, transfer taxes, staging costs, and pre-sale repairs routinely add another 1 to 2% on top of commissions. On a $1.1 million home, total sell-side transaction costs can reach $70,000 to $90,000. This creates a break-even threshold that the property must clear through appreciation before the owner can exit without a net loss on the transaction. In markets with modest or flat appreciation profiles, that threshold may require a holding period of 4 to 6 years. Buyers who may face liquidity needs, employment transitions, or geographic relocations within that window are accepting a level of illiquidity risk that is inconsistent with a conservative capital preservation strategy. The aggregate picture that emerges from these 10 factors is not one of catastrophe. Residential real estate in the United States remains one of the most reliable long-term wealth-building instruments available to individuals. But the window between disciplined acquisition and financial overextension is narrower in 2026 than it has been in decades. For buyers operating in the $700,000 to $2 million range, the difference between a position that compounds favorably over a 10-year horizon and one that creates sustained cash flow pressure is almost entirely attributable to the precision of pre-acquisition modeling. The buyers who will preserve and grow capital over the next decade are those who underwrite every cost category with the same rigor they apply to the purchase price itself, who account for tax trajectory, insurance volatility, maintenance reserves, and transaction costs on both entry and exit before they submit an offer. That discipline is not pessimism. It is the foundational practice of every sophisticated real estate investor operating at the highest levels of the market.